Well, good morning, Greater Fort Lauderdale. My name is Bob Swindell, and I'm President and CEO of the Greater Fort Lauderdale Alliance. Welcome to our 10th event in our Leadership Speaker Series. Today, we look forward to an authentic conversation about leadership between leaders of one of the nation's top automotive companies and one of the most respected higher education leaders in the United States. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors who are listed on the screen, as well as the South Florida Business Journal, our media sponsor. Presenting sponsor for today's leadership series is JM Family Enterprises. We appreciate all the sponsors for the series over the past 12 months. This has been a great concept that Gail Bulfin came up with during our COVID pandemic period, and I think it's kept our organization really connected. And now onto our program. Our moderator for today's program is Chairman of the Board of JM Family Enterprises. They are ranked number 19 on Forbes' list of America's largest private companies. And for 22 consecutive years, they're one of the best places to work for, as ranked by Forbes magazine in their top 100. He joined the family-owned enterprise in 1992 as Vice President and General Counsel. So he put that law degree to work for a little while. He was appointed Chief Operating Officer in 1997 and President in 2000. He served as President and CEO from 2003 to 2018. After 15 years, holding the first non-family member to hold the role of President and CEO, Colin moved solely into the role of Chairman of the Board in July of 2018. So now I want to turn it over to our moderator today, Mr. Colin Brown.
I am honored today to have a dialogue with Gregory Haile, who is the 7th president of Broward College, having assumed the role on July 1, 2018, at only the ripe age of 40 years old. Previously, President Haile served as the General Counsel and Vice President for Public Policy and Government Affairs for Broward College. And then prior to that, he was a corporate litigator. Greg is a graduate of Columbia Law School and Arizona State University. That is a dry introduction to someone who has an absolutely fascinating background and fascinating life, I should say. So starting off, I would like to say that you, Greg, you have had a interesting journey, I should say, to become president of a very impressive greater institution. Starting with your background in Jamaica, South Jamaica, Queens, in New York, where you didn't even know there was such a thing as higher education until you were in middle school. Why don't you share a little bit about that story?
Yeah, no, it'd be my pleasure. First, let me thank Bob and Gail and the Alliance team for having me today. I remember a year ago when I was invited to do this, and I quickly said yes, and I was grateful that I was even asked. And then when I saw that you, Colin, would be paired up for this discussion, I was absolutely honored. You're someone I've admired for much of my career, so thank you for taking the time as well. You know, when so I grew up in South Jamaica, Queens, New York, and you know, I don't know how well the audience knows the context of that neighborhood, but I grew up there in the 1980s and late 1980s and early 1990s, and it was a very challenging time, a very challenging neighborhood. The time, frankly, being that it was at the height of the crack epidemic in New York City, and this was, frankly, one of the worst neighborhoods in New York City. When I think about what my neighborhood looked like, frankly, I'll try to paint somewhat of a picture. In my home, I had bars on every window in my home. When I looked across the street from my home, it was a boarded up home where there was a lot of illegal activity and drugs being sold, and the kind of thing that you don't necessarily want to see coming out of your home every day. I had lost friends both to the left and to the right of my home, and frankly, it was just a very violent environment. I once had a bullet coming through my living room window. And to the point you raised, Colin, about exposure to post-secondary education, I did not have that, at least not in any material way, surely until I got a bit older. I come from a relatively large family with about 130 cousins, if you can believe that. And I would actually go on to be the first person in my family to go to college. And I think about a lot of levels of exposure that came relatively late, at least I think about my children, perhaps as others think about theirs. And one of the really critical things that my mother did was, in the third grade, she had lied about my address so that I could go to school in a better neighborhood, at least a neighborhood that had greater resources and greater wealth. And so starting in the third grade, I would go through the projects, and then I would get on the bus for about 45 minutes, and then I'd get off the bus and walk for a few more minutes before I got to my elementary school. And the exposure that I had that came in such a fickle manner came in 1989. And I was graduating from elementary school, sixth grade. And I said to a classmate who was at least financially better off than I was, isn't this amazing? We're going to be the last class of the decade. And he immediately, without any hesitation, says to me, no, we're going to be the last class of the millennium because we're going to graduate college in 1999. And so that becomes the first time I actually hear the word college. And when I lean into that memory, though, what I really think about is how a sixth grader had not only not heard the word college and heard it in this fickle manner, but another sixth grader knew exactly what year he was going to graduate. And I walk with this belief system today that kind of divide should not exist, but it does. And it is not a unique divide, but it does exist. So my mother continues to perpetuate this false address narrative through middle school. And then in the ninth grade, it becomes readily apparent that we can no longer continue this narrative. And my mother does everything she can to keep me from going to the high school in my neighborhood, the high school that I was zoned for. She would literally go to friends and say, do you know anyone who lives in a nice neighborhood whose address that we can take advantage of, that we can leverage to support me, her son? We're unable to do that. She takes me to every school other than the one that I'm zoned for, and they tell me one of two things. One, you're not zoned for this institution, or two, you don't have the grades to get in. So I end up going to my high school in the neighborhood that I'm zoned for. And this high school, Springfield Gardens High School, was in the first cohort of 40 schools in New York City that would require metal detectors. And so when you showed up at school, there was a long line that you always had to wait on before you were able to get to the entrance of the building, and then you'd have to go through multiple layers of metal detectors in order to get in. But it had some other unfortunate qualities as well. It was also known for having one of the highest HIV rates. It was known for having one of the highest teen pregnancy rates. And, unfortunately, the list goes on and on. It's the kind of thing you hate to have to look at from a data perspective from a school that you're going to attend. But this is the school that I attended. And just, it was one of those things where you always knew every day, because the school was a reflection of the neighborhood, that there were going to be challenges that you had to navigate. But with some good fortune, with the support of folks, and frankly, with a lot of luck, a lot of perseverance, I was able to eventually graduate from high school in that community.
Well, the interesting thing is a lot of people hear the word college, but that doesn't mean they get motivated to go to college. And having heard the background that you came from and going to a high school that sounded very, very tough, were there any mentors in the school that urged you to, or saw your potential and said, you ought to go to higher education, and help motivate you to have that drive?
I got to tell you, Colin, so the short answer is, there wasn't a lot of consciousness about post-secondary engagement in my school. My high school, frankly, doesn't even exist anymore, at least not in the same form. They had to break it up because it was of its violence, and it was a dropout factory. And I think, frankly, they did the right thing by breaking it up. But, when I went to college, I won't suggest for a moment that when I was going there because I knew that I was going to go there and be successful and achieve after graduating. What I was doing when I went to college was being conscious about how do I evade the environment that I was currently living in. And unfortunately, it was not as much about what kind of academic success I would have in the future, but what was going to be the avenue for ameliorating the challenges that I was currently facing. And again, these challenges were routine. I think in my high school, there were about 300 folks in our graduating class. And I remember maybe, 30 to 40 of us went to some form of post-secondary education. This was not, again, something that was given a high level of consciousness for us. And the truth is, Colin, when we are thinking about the environments that a lot of individuals were growing up in, the challenge, the thought isn't, how much academic rigor there is. The thought is, am I going to get home safely? Right? How am I going to navigate this environment, and what will tomorrow be like if we can even get there? So, but I will tell you this: it wasn't even something that I was all too thoughtful about. I didn't question at the time why no one was talking about college. When I think about the neighborhood I lived in, I talked to you about the home in the immediate neighborhood, but when I used to go to the movie theaters, there were metal detectors in the movie theaters, and because there had been a shooting. And that was the answer to that shooting without adding metal detectors. When I would go to the convenience stores, what we call bodegas, you would have 2 layers of bulletproof glass between the vendor and the customer. This was pervasive. So these were the things that we thought about. These were the things that were natural to our environment, not what was on the other side, i.e. post-secondary engagement. And clearly that's unfortunate, but clearly that's an important element of understanding for me, particularly in the role that I sit in now, and I know for this community as well, as we try to be difference makers for a lot of students who have the ability, but perhaps didn't have the fortuitous conversation in the 6th grade that maybe sparked an interest. Not that it led to it. I won't suggest for a moment that I was all of a sudden motivated to do this, but it took a lot more for me to get to the point of actually post-secondary engagement.
Well, nobody would want to wish the kind of experience that you had to go through your childhood, but it's clear that because of that experience, you have provided a level of perspective and leadership now that you are the president of Broward College to do some really terrific things, which we will get into a little bit later. But you ended up going to Arizona State, which is about as far away other than maybe California that you could go from New York City. And when you parachuted in there, that had to be mind-boggling to you when you first arrived.
Yeah. So, it's interesting because, so I'll tell you a little bit about how I actually arrived at Arizona State. When I started to decide what I wanted to do or where I wanted to go, actually, I should back up a little bit. So when I was, I think it was in the 9th grade, I'll never forget that, unfortunately, it was a Columbus Day. I was out playing handball, which is a very popular inner city sport in New York. For those who don't know, it's much like racquetball, except it's with your hand. Imagine a wall outside that's in front of you, 20 feet high, 20 feet wide, and you have a rubber ball that's about 2 inches in diameter, and much like a racquetball, you would hit it with your hand. Well, I played this sport nearly religiously, and my mother always knew that if I wasn't home, I was likely to be in the park playing handball. And so one Columbus Day, I was in the park playing handball, the day off from school. And I'll never forget about a dozen older but younger young men essentially jumped me. And one of the, it was a very, very difficult experience. It's even a difficult experience to recall. But, the reality is it didn't go very well for me, and it culminated in one of them smashing a bottle in the middle of my forehead right here. And I'll never forget, I was wearing a white jacket and white sneakers, white Bo Jackson sneakers. And the jacket was drenched in blood. My white sneakers were drenched in blood. And I escaped this. I go home. When you go into my home, the first thing you see is a floor to ceiling mirror. And I can see my reflection. And in my jacket and my shoes drenched in blood in the mirror. My mother comes running down the stairs, and she actually starts patting me and yelling and patting me, wondering if I had been shot. The ambulance arrives. There's a lot of chaos in the community, and the community's well aware of what's happening. And I'm in the ambulance, laying on the gurney. My mother is holding my hand, and I look at her, and I probably said one of the most difficult things I've ever said to her, and I wish I could take it back if I could, but I said, why do we have to live here? And why do we have to experience this? And so here I was saying this to her at a time where she was probably experiencing it, probably in a more challenging way than I was, even to watch her son in that scenario. And I remember always thinking there must be some way, right? There must be some way, even if for her, there was no way at the moment, there must be some way that I could escape this. So, you know, I think about how that eventually evolved to, there was only one way that I could think of, right? That had come to my senses, and that was post-secondary engagement. And so, yes, indeed, Colin, I decided I wanted to go as far as I could possibly go from the environment. And I ended up picking Arizona State again for a really fortuitous way. I started looking at the admissions requirements, and Arizona State had 3 requirements. They said you had to have a decent SAT score, which I had. They said you had to have at least, I think it was either 3.0 or 3.25. I had neither. And you had to meet 2 of 3 requirements. The third one was you had to be in the top 25% of your class. So the unusual irony about my academic credentials, I was in the top 15% of my class with my 2.7 GPA in high school. And so I decided to go to Arizona State University, and I actually go there sight unseen. I did not realize, because I had no family members to lean on, I did not realize that you were supposed to visit the schools that you went to. And so here I go, 2,500 miles across the country to an institution that did wonders for me, but I go there sight unseen. And one of the greatest oddities I will tell you is that I felt so uncomfortable when I saw that they did not have metal detectors. And I would ask myself, how could this environment be safe? Because that's how I grew up. I was used to safety being accounted for by the metal detectors and the bulletproof glass that shielded you from the inevitable violence that could be pervasive. So I learned a lot through that experience. I learned I was actually quite behind academically, and went to an institution that frankly transformed my life about what was possible, helped me understand, and gave me a virtual hug and wrapped itself around me in terms of understanding my own capacity. I think about the professors who helped me understand my capacity, some of whom took chances, some of whom pulled me aside and helped me understand personally that I was capable of being successful in this environment. And it really changed how I could think about myself and my future. And I believe that that's a critical role for post-secondary engagement. It's to help individuals think about, despite the challenges that they faced historically, the capacity continues to grow, because if they continue to grow and they have the support around them, then anything is truly possible for their futures.
Well, just as an aside, you graduated magna cum laude. You received the most outstanding graduate award for your college. And most importantly, that's where you met your wife.
Yeah, absolutely. I met Shay and in my freshman year, and we became fast friends. Started dating about a year later, and it's been bliss ever since.
Well, congratulations. So you end up going to law school at Columbia. Why law school?
It's a very fair question. You know, when I decided, I actually had applied to law schools as well as PhD programs, and even had gotten admitted to some joint JD PhD programs. And, you know, I remember, so I didn't know any lawyers but one. And this lawyer was the dean of admissions at Arizona State University. So I don't even know if he ever practiced law, but he had a JD. And he was a mentor, and he was someone that I trusted. And I had doubts about what I wanted to do. And I will tell you, there were 2, again, just odd circumstances, you know, that I was exposed to at the time. I said to him, Dean Miller, I said, you know, I'm not sure if I want to go to law school. And he made it very simple for me. He said, look, if you go to, I think you'll be a great lawyer. He goes, but if you go to law school and you don't like it, or you practice law and you don't like it, then you'll just do something else. And I said, oh, well, okay, that helped to me, right? It wasn't as though if I made this decision, I was all sentencing myself to a life of X. It meant that I still had the flexibility when he shared that with me, and that meant a lot. And then I remember also reading an article, I think it was in Fortune magazine, and the article at the time suggested that it showed the list of Fortune 500 CEOs, and the article focused on the reality that a number of them had JDs. And I said, and frankly, Colin, you're obviously an incredible example of that, that they had JDs. And I said, oh, well, I guess I could do something else with this. So I went forward. And then the other key component of going to Columbia, frankly, was my wife went to NYU. We were looking to go to schools in the same city. And then when we had choices, it became really easy, in fact, because I wanted my wife, then girlfriend, now wife, to spend some time with my family, and she embraced that. But also I wanted actually the chance to go back to my high school. One of the things I used to think about as a kid, I just wondered, I just said, how come no one comes back to this community? How come there isn't anyone saying that there's something good on the other side of the challenges in this community? This is going to sound very strange, Colin, perhaps, but there was an artist, very famous artist, many of you know, Tupac Shakur, and I'll never forget, he came to my neighborhood, did a free concert when I was a kid at a park, no true stage, just did a concert. And one of the things that he was saying to us was, we need to stop hurting each other. We need to literally stop killing each other. And when I heard him say that, I remember that was the only time I remember someone coming into the community to say something like that to us. And so when I graduated high school and I went to law school inevitably, and then I realized I had a chance to come back and say, on the other side of these long lines, on the other side of these metal detectors, on the other side of the challenges that you're facing today, there is possibility. And so I had a chance to do that and go back to my high school very early on in my law school days and have conversations with even some of the security guards there and some of the students there, and just get a better understanding, as well as hopefully provide some understanding of what's possible on the other side of the metal detectors that they're going through every day.
That's incredible. So you were in Arizona for a period of time. You go back to New York. How did you end up in South Florida?
So as I mentioned, I was at Columbia Law School, and Shay was at NYU. We're actually living in Queens together in Astoria. And I frankly woke her up in the middle of the night to fly her to South Florida to surprise her with a marriage proposal. She says, yes, we're on the beach, and I propose, and she says yes. And then she says, you know what, I think we should live here. And I said, okay. I said, let's see if we can pull that off. And we spent 4 days in South Florida before we decided that this is the place that we wanted to be. So shortly thereafter, I started looking into opportunities to start my legal career in South Florida. And in 2002, I flew down to start my career at Holland & Knight as a class action securities litigator. And again, one of the just greatest experience and opportunities was making this transition to South Florida. Shay and I were welcomed. We continued to fall in love with this community over and over, and frankly started to get very involved. We did not know anyone other than those that I'd worked with, but no one that we had known for years to lean on while we were here. So I started to get very involved in the community in a number of organizations, and I spent about 7.5, 8 years as a corporate litigator, and inevitably had the opportunity to transition into the general counsel and vice president role at Broward College. My first day working at Broward College was on September 12th of 2011. And the funny thing is, I remember, this was probably, so I started here in 2011. I remember probably in 2008, 2009, I had been involved in so many different organizations, and I would have conversations with folks. And I remember one in particular where I just was brainstorming about, if I could do one thing, if I could concentrate my energies in one space, what would it be? And it really helped me understand and think through the things that have had the greatest impact on my life. Beyond the love of my family, I will tell you without any hesitation whatsoever, post-secondary engagement changed my life. And I also reflect on even the experiences I shared with you in high school, even the worst experiences. Those still drive me, right? Those are the things that I think about when I think about the service that we provide, as we think about lifting all individuals in this community. What are the challenges that individuals are facing? So when I started to focus on what would that one thing I'd want to do, higher education became very salient to me. I didn't necessarily think about Broward College. I didn't necessarily think about any colleges. It was a couple of years before I even joined. But then I got a fortuitous notification around the opportunity that Broward College was providing and that they were looking for, despite being an institution with 5,000 employees. And as you mentioned, one of the largest institutions in the nation and successful at that. They had never had an in-house general counsel. And here I was, a successful corporate litigation career, and it became apparent to me that there was this opportunity to work in higher education. And it was a bit of a leap, to be frank with you. I was in a space that I enjoyed, that I was, I had no reason to think that I wouldn't continue to do what I was doing. But then this opportunity came, and marrying it with, frankly, the experiences that I had, and then the capacity, and I learned about Broward College students and how Broward College serves this community. I really couldn't imagine being anywhere else than working for an institution that exists to transform lives just as mine was transformed.
Well, one of the things, because I am engaged both in my law school and where I went undergraduate, and know a lot about higher education from that perspective, that it's very rare that you see someone from the staff, let alone a lawyer, ultimately get selected to become the president to lead the entire institution. What was it that you were doing, or what were the traits, if you don't mind being a little immodest, that sort of caught the attention of the board into thinking that you were the right selection to be the next leader for Broward College after David Armstrong, who was a very successful leader for Broward?
Yeah. So I'll kind of harken on the last point that you make. So I had the privilege of being David Armstrong, President Armstrong's direct report for about 8 years, and really working closely with him and seeing the great ways with which he had led the institution. And, you ask about, the board's thought around it. I'll tell you this, when I think about the role of a general counsel, one of the things that I am very conscious of is there is a compass of morality of an organization. And one of the things that I've always embodied, I've always tried to embody, is to ensure that as the role of general counsel, where folks are often reaching out to lean on you, not just to say what I can and cannot do, but is this right or is this ethical? And I think, frankly, when I think about leaders like you, Colin, and leaders like many in our community who understand the responsibility that they have as leaders, one of the things that is that evolves, I think, as leaders is that the higher you go up in leadership, the more you realize that the work you do becomes less about you and more about your service to your organization. And in many ways, not just your service to your organization, but your service to your organization and your community at large. And in many ways, the role of the general counsel is that. And I tend to believe that folks recognize some of that parallel. But regardless of that recognition, it's one of the things that, in my view, is undoubtedly true, whether it be in that role or in this role as CEO or president of an organization. It is so incredibly important to get comfortable with the understanding that the role is not about you in any way whatsoever, but how you are going to leverage everything about you and all you can bring to the table to serve others. And I told the board on March 9th, March 9th of 2018, when they selected me to be in the seat. And frankly, after being quite emotional and struck by the selection, one of the things I told them was that I would do everything possible to help ensure that their decision was one that they would be proud of. And, I spend every day trying to make sure I live up to that promise.
Well, I know you haven't disappointed based on everything that's taken place since then, but I've heard you say that applying for the position of the presidency was a risk, a huge risk. Can you explain a little bit about what you would say to folks about the calculus of taking risks?
Yeah. So, look, I think there's a twofold risk. I think, one is a practical risk, but the other one is, I would say, without trying to speak too gravely about this, more like a spiritual risk, if you will. One of the things that is just a very practical reality is that when you are in a candidate for a position, at least in my world, when you're a candidate for a position like this, if you don't get it, oftentimes your next step is out of the organization. That's just the reality. It's a conversation that I had with my wife, and she embraced that reality as well. The latter point I was making around the emotional or spiritual side of the risk is the risk of not doing it and having to live with that decision not to have tried. I think it's critically important when you love what you do, when you believe in the potential for greater good, and that you could be instrumental in helping achieve that greater good. To have said no to that opportunity would be to have said no to the potential to achieve greater good, not for yourself, but for this community and for this institution. That's in many ways not only how I view this role, but how we behave. When I think about the opportunities to make differences in varying ways, in varying life cycles, in this community and in the lives of others, it's very important for us and the people of our institution to be conscious of being assertive about having that kind of impact and not shying away from having that impact, even if, to your point, Colin, calculating risk, even if it's never been done before, even if people say it's too ambitious, even if people say, if you fail, it will hurt you. Despite all of those things that tend to come into play, particularly in the lives of leaders, particularly in the lives of public leaders, you always have to be thinking about, but on the other side of that is the potential impact you can have, again, on the lives of others, many of whom are still, like me, in the 6th grade, not exposed to the opportunities that could otherwise transform their lives.
So when you became president in July of 2018, I know one of the first things you did was to go around in the community to introduce yourself to those who maybe had not been exposed to you before. I know that personally because you came up to visit with me within weeks of the time that you became president. Why did you do that? And what were you hoping to achieve by doing that?
So despite the fact that I had been working in this community since 2004, I never took for granted the fact that there was so much that I still needed to learn, even though I was in this role. And I still don't take that for granted. I need to continue to learn and continue to spend time. And I'll tell you, and I've thanked you before, and I'll thank you again for opening the door to give me the opportunity. And I think, frankly, our conversation is a great example. When I had a chance to spend time with you, Colin, time that I'm very grateful for, one of the things that you shared with me was the incredible import of the culture that had been created at JM Family. and the importance of how culture drives so much of the success that you have, that you've seen, the retention of incredible employees. And I think about the times that I've been with your teammates, and all they talk about is how wonderful the culture is at your organization. And so one of the things I try to ensure that I do is I don't just learn and leave it. I learn it and then try to inculcate those valuable ideas and tools into our organization. So in large part because of the conversations that you and I had, we went to work on our own culture at Broward College, making sure that we were putting our colleagues in at a level of priority and ensuring that every day we are working on driving the culture of this organization, because we know the culture of this organization inside determines how we impact our students in the community outside. And I had the benefit of doing that with a number of leaders in this community, and I'll continue to take advantage of those opportunities, because without it, I don't get better and this institution does get better. It's a great avenue for ensuring that we continue to grow and continue to serve in a greater capacity.
Well, I didn't expect that kind of an answer, but you know, I appreciate it anyway. What did you when you became president, were there some areas that you knew immediately that you wanted to focus on?
Yeah. So here I was, you know, becoming president of an incredible institution that had a fantastic foundation. And, you know, one of the things I started to talk about, and even during my interview, frankly, with the board, is the reality that we have achieved a lot, but there was still an incredibly important opportunity to achieve even more. You know, one of the things that I always talk to our team about, but it's not necessarily widely known, is that President Truman, back in 1947, commissioned leadership to come together and discuss the importance of higher education, and specifically the importance of community colleges. And at that time, he was challenging the nation and challenging the system of community colleges to ensure that geographic barriers were removed so that everyone would have the opportunity. And as he said, and the commission reported, that opportunity was not determined simply by the wealth of your father, simply by your race, or simply where you live. And so one of the things that we started to look at from a data perspective is, as we think about the students that we serve and serve so well, who are we missing? Who are those who have all the talent in the world, but simply don't have the appropriate level of exposure? Or I'll even talk about it. In college, we talk all the time about a student's sense of belonging on campus. One of the things I think about is the sense of belonging of those who've never arrived at our campuses. So think about this, Colin. I have two daughters, Hadley and Sloan, 9 and 6 respectively. And I'll never forget when we moved into Fort Lauderdale, and I took my daughter for the first day of class in the first grade, Hadley. And we walked to her class, and we get to the threshold of her doorway. And I look up, and above the threshold is the picture of a mascot and the name of a college. And so here she is, and I look down the hallway, and above every threshold is another mascot and another name of a college. And what her school is doing is that they are making it impossible for her not to realize and see the opportunity to go to college, right? So you have in one generation, me, who hears the word in the most fickle fashion possible, and my daughter, who will never go a day without being exposed. Both of them now. And so we think about these communities, though, that don't have that kind of exposure. I talk to my daughters all the time about college. They could name several that they'd like to go to. That is ideal, but there truly is no difference between them and someone in a community that is devoid of this conversation, but for the conversation. And so we started to look at where we were in terms of serving those communities. We talk about them as our Broward Up communities, those with high unemployment rates, and more importantly, a very important corollary, low attainment rates. And we looked at where we were, where our brick and mortar sites were. And unfortunately, when we compared it to those zip codes, our Broward Up communities, we were touching one of those zip codes with one of our sites. In other words, Imagine this, Colin. We were essentially asking those with the greatest challenges, those who have no transportation, those who may not have the technology infrastructure, those who may not even have the time because they're working multiple jobs and maybe a single parent, to find a way to get to us. And so what we talked about and inevitably activated was what we call Broward Up, recognizing the unlimited potential of everyone in our community. And we started to engage in our community, frankly, like never before. Recognize the need to acculturate everyone into post-secondary opportunity. That meant partnering with, and in this county, I would argue that it is the most collaborative in the nation in terms of partnering with municipalities, partnering with nonprofit organizations, and actually bringing post-secondary engagement in classroom education into the hearts of the very same community. So in short, Colin, if I were to show you a map 3 years ago of where we were located, you would see that we were barely touching the communities that I would suggest needed us most. And 3 years later, we've actually added 26 locations via partnership to now smother those communities, to ensure that college engagement is not fickle. It is not by chance. It is exposure between their home and the bus stop, ensuring that the opportunity is readily apparent and available to them.
Well, I'm on the executive committee of Florida Tax Watch, and they recently did an independent assessment of the value of Broward Up, and it gave it incredible praise. They concluded, among other things, that for every dollar spent, the benefits from tax revenue, reduced public assistance, gives a return on investment of over $13. $1 in a return of $13. One of the things that you are now well known for is receiving from Mackenzie Scott a gift of $30 million as a result of the Broward Up experience. Did you have any knowledge in advance? Did they talk to you about what you were doing, and you knew that you were maybe in the running for something? Tell us how that all came about.
Colin, I wish there was a lot to tell, but the reality is I received a phone call from a member of her team, and the phone call was essentially to tell me that we were going to receive this $30 million gift. They said that they had been researching our work, and they said, and the quote was, blown away and inspired by our Broward Up work. And I wish I could tell you that I knew that they were spying us out, but I had no clue. And even to this day, I have no clue of how exactly they do it. You see a lot of articles now and how they have a team of researchers and how exhaustive they are with their work to determine where they want to make their investments. United Way, Broward County, also receives an investment as well for their great work. But I wish I could tell you that there was a lot of hype for us to build up to, but there really wasn't. It was just an incredibly humbling recognition of the work that we're doing. And I just want to be very clear about this. And I come back to that culture of collaboration, not just inside the institution, but outside of the institution. We have a lot of folks at this institution who came together to say, this is the work that we want to do. We also had a lot of folks outside of the institution, the nonprofits in this community, the cities in this community, the municipal leadership in this community, the business leadership in this community, who all came together and said, this is worth our energy. This is worth our resources. But for this engagement, we don't get that gift, right? When I started having this conversation around the need to be perpetually engaged in these communities, one of the first challenges in terms of questions that I received was, well, where are you going to get the money to build the buildings, right? And I said, we're going to find a way to do this without building buildings, because that takes time, right? We know that there's a need today, and if it wasn't for the institutions, the partners that came forward, we would not be nearly as far along as we were. Colin, you'll relate to this. When I was a litigator, I loved doing injunctive relief cases. And these were cases that were hyper fast paced, hyper intense. And you would get to trial and you would, condense it all in just a matter of weeks as opposed to a matter of years. And the reason you would do that is because you were trying to address an immediate and irreparable harm. And so when I think about how aggressive we've been about this work, think about all the days that go by before people are exposed to opportunity that can change their lives. To me, that is an immediate and irreparable harm that this community has decided to address. And so when we received the gift from Mackenzie, it was a great acknowledgement of the work of the people of Broward College, but it was just as much an acknowledgement of the work of the partners throughout this community who have served in this effort.
Well, I think one of the things that it would be good for you to remind people who are listening to this that although you have received this $30 million gift, that does not mean you are continuing to seek support.
That's right.
In the community for all the work that you're doing, both in terms of providing space, but also providing financial support.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for saying that, Colin. Indeed, what we are trying to ameliorate are challenges that have existed for decades. And yes, we want to ameliorate this in a way that is not about doing something for 1 year or 2 years. The question, I think, for this community is, what is it like to engage in perpetuity, to have a perpetual impact on this community, on Broward County, right? When we think about how we want to lift this community, I always tend to think about it, how do we think about GDP per capita per person? If you want to have the greatest impact, we have to think about how we lift the masses, not lift the few. And how do we do that in a perpetual way? We can only do that from a community-wide perspective. And so that need undoubtedly exists. I'll share a data point that I often share, but it's critically important to understand. One, when we think about the importance of post-secondary engagement, every economist will tell you that post-secondary attainment leads to higher income outcomes over your lifetime. What is also true is that you will have a longer life. All the data tells us that you will have a better quality of life, that you are less likely to need public assistance, that you are less likely to be unemployed. And if you are unemployed, you're less likely to stay unemployed. These are all incredible benefits to our community just by way of achieving post-secondary attainment. The other one is probably a little bit more grim, but hopefully at least just as inspiring. There's a gentleman by the name of Raj Chetty, who I have had the pleasure of working with in our institution, has had the pleasure of working with for essentially just after I became president when I introduced myself to him. Dr. Chetty, he is the youngest tenured economic professor in Harvard's nearly 400-year history. And his work is grounded in economic mobility, right? And one of the things I recommend all of you take a look at this, it's called the Opportunity Atlas. One of the things that he's built is this online platform that will tell you the likely income outcomes over your lifetime based simply on the zip code that you live in. In other words, imagine where you grow up having the greatest impact on your economic success in your life. I think I know this community well enough now that is not the community that we want to be. And it is not the one that we strive to be. We strive to be one that ensures equitable opportunity for all in our community, designed to lift all in our community. And so I share that with you, Colin, as we continue to think about the needs long-term and ensuring that we can accomplish the goals that we've set for ourselves.
Well, I was going to call you the $30 million man, but earlier this week, you received a grant from the U.S. Department of Education over a 5-year period of another $30 million. Can you explain what that's all about?
Yeah, oh gosh. Just another humbling investment in our community and our work. So the grant is from the US DOE, as you mentioned, and it's a Promise Neighborhoods grant. And I'll just continue to drive home the point that I started. This is a grant that is, again, an investment in this community. So imagine as we have our traditional Broward Up work, in which we have, as a community, decided to engage all adults in our Broward Up zip codes and now beyond in post-secondary attainment opportunities. What this now does is think about how do we create belonging and opportunity, not just for adults, but through the K through 12, pre-K through 12 system. And so in our Broward Up communities now, we have us and 13 other organizations who have come together, and this investment will be leveraged to create opportunity and ameliorate challenges. So imagine in these most challenged communities, the homelessness and food insecurity that many of those students face that inevitably impact their ability to be successful in school and transition to college, as well as transition to the workforce. We've brought in Broward Partnership for the Homeless to help support some of that work. We've brought in Jack and Jill Children's Center, who will support the work at the pre-K through 5th grade level. We have organizations like Handy that are involved. We have the YMCA. We have so many organizations who are collectively, again, through this grant, coming together to ensure quality opportunity, again, equitable opportunity for those in our most challenged communities, from not only, again, the adult sector, but now from cradle to career, if you will. And it is a monumental investment for this community. And I'm very grateful, again, that we've been able to lead this, but even more grateful that the community has come together to make this difference together.
Now, part of the grant, as I understand it, is also a challenge to the community to raise $15 million in addition to the 30 that they will be parceling out. So that's a message for the entire community to say, hey, we need to rally around both Broward Up, but also the Promise neighborhood initiative that you will be launching.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, Colin. Yes, we continue to look for investors to engage in this transformational work. And I welcome the opportunity, of course, to spend time with anyone who's interested in learning more. My team is available. I'm available. This is critically important for our community. It is transformational for our community. And it's an opportunity to make the kinds of difference that for decades have gone unresolved. They've seemed intractable. But now we have investors not only here locally who care more about this community, about these communities and understand it, but also investors from outside of our community who understand the import of what we're doing and want to join us in making this difference.
Well, we could go on for hours because your experience and the things that you are engaged in, we haven't even touched on your activity with the Atlanta Fed. We haven't touched on any of your leadership roles in the community and various civic and nonprofit profit engagements. I'll just leave it with the fact that you do all of that. I don't know how many balls you keep in the air, but is there any last message that you would like to say to our audience?
Well, look, I extend my gratitude to your audience, to our audience, and because the way that we continue to come together is, I think, one of the most powerful elements of this community, and I'm just blessed to help to be involved in the great work that this community brings and the way it serves. So, Colin, thank you for taking the time to engage me, both not just here, but throughout my opportunity to lead this institution to help me get better. And I'm grateful for all those who take the time as well.
Well, I'm glad that you made the decision to pop the question of marriage in South Florida as opposed to somewhere else, because what you two have contributed to the well-being of Broward County and all of South Florida is really incredible. And I'm glad that Broward College's initiatives are getting the national recognition it deserves. And I want to thank you for your leadership.
It is my honor and privilege, sir. Thank you so much.
Well, Colin and Greg, thank you so much. This has been a phenomenal way for us to conclude our leadership series. You guys both represent such great qualities of our community. One of the things that strikes me is that you both went through the rigor of a law school education, and the importance of that in whether you practice law or not. And to your mentor's credit, Dean Miller, Greg, that education you receive, you can always use later in life. And you both have done that. And it strikes me that, when you look at the advantages of law school, whether it's debate, I tell parents when we talk about debate programs, it's not about your kids being argumentative. It's really about the importance of critical thinking, how words are important, and persuasive leadership. And those are skills that you pick up through law school and through that rigorous training. And I'd be remiss if I didn't share with the audience, if you don't know this, Broward County Public Schools have the largest, most robust debate program in the United States. Several local attorneys have been involved. They adopt high schools and middle schools. And we have students throughout the system involved in the debate program for exactly those reasons. Critical thinking and how you organize your thoughts, how do you persuade your peers. And coming up next month on November 2nd, there's actually an annual luncheon that highlights our debate program at Broward County Schools. It'll be at the Broward Center of Performing Arts. I'd encourage you all, please check your Alliance e-news. There'll be a mention of the November 2nd luncheon. Senator George Lemieux, a longtime friend of both Colin and Greg's, as well as the Alliance, has been leading this initiative with Broward County Public Schools and several law firms in Broward County. But again, one of the reasons that program is so important is that those skills are skills that can follow a student for life. And I'd be remiss also if I didn't talk a little bit about President Haile's leadership when it comes to economic mobility in Broward County. Clearly, you can see his passion for that. He's actually introduced us to Professor Chetty's team. And clearly in those conversations, they have a tremendous amount of respect for what Greg does. But the program Broward Up and in conjunction with what we're doing at the Alliance Foundation with Prosperity Broward and focusing on zip codes that have the highest rates of unemployment, children in poverty, working in those communities to minimize barriers and create genuine career path opportunities for folks is something that we work on together. Really important to not only the Alliance, but to our community in the long run, and really creating a new way of looking at how we get involved in students' lives earlier, and really shifting, the traditional thinking and how we get started early in a young person's life. High school is often too late. We need to intercede, at third grade and before, when learning and reading skills are critically important to long-term learning. Thank you all for participating today. Have a productive and successful Friday and a great weekend, and we will see you next month, actually in December. Thank you all.